morning by giving speeches, by speeches, and then you end the night with a speech, and then a three-hour drive to Viborg, or Herning, I guess, is where we're staying. But it's and then you have a full day here, and it starts again tomorrow. And that is the magic of the job. But I love the job, and I will give every ounce of myself to personally ensuring that this relationship is better the day I leave than the day I came. So that's it. That's generally what we're up to. That's a bit of my personal story. And with that, I think I will open the floor up to questions. And again, please, feel free to, if I didn't touch on something that you're interested in, please ask. And I'm not afraid of tough questions, by the way, too. So if they're on your mind, as far as I'm concerned, it's my responsibility to answer them. And I can also talk about the domestic political situation in the U.S. I know people probably have thoughts or questions about Hillary or the Republican field and all the rest. But I've worked with all of them before, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Now you have the opportunity to ask questions. And we have here Michael from Viborg Morning Club, Rotary Morning Club, and we have here Carsten from Viborg Rotary Club, and myself is from Viborg Rotary Club. Then you are just confused, but it doesn't matter. Then please raise your hand if you have a question. If you have a question in Danish, it's okay. They translate. Or Kirsten down here will translate. So here you are. First one.
Thank you. After your opinion, what major impact has the U.S. had on globalization?
Sorry, one more time.
After your opinion, what major impact has the U.S. on globalization?
So what, as generally speaking, what impact does the U.S. have on globalization? Oh, yes. I think we play a very large role in the concept of globalization, but so does Europe. I think the concept, of course, every single day, every single week, every single month, every single year, I would argue the world is more and more interconnected and more globalized. My belief is that that's a good thing. I am an international guy. I am not a protectionist. I believe that the more we can tear down our borders in some ways and raise our standards, I think it's a good thing. But do I think the U.S. is, and I will say this, globalization is inherently, I think it's inherently good, but it's not always good. There are certainly examples of where globalization may have had a negative impact on a society. So I'm certainly not saying that, and I believe that. But I think ultimately, a more international world is a better world. So I think that's mostly the answer to the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, switching gears. Danish society is very equal. What are your thoughts on the inequality in American society and the American justice system? Specifically, the Black Lives Matter and the riots in Baltimore?
Yeah. It's a great question. And it's something that, we think about and talk about a lot. I'll sort of back up a little bit in trying to answer the question and just sort of talking a little bit about American culture to begin with. So, and where this kind of stuff comes from. So the U.S., a lot of people consider the United States as being this fantastic success story when it comes to immigration, right? We're by far the most diverse country on earth, racially, culturally. The number of languages spoken in New York and Los Angeles public schools is in the hundreds, they tell me, which is astounding to me, and also an enormous challenge for the culture. And overall, big picture, that's actually quite true, that we've done, considering the stakes, we've done a pretty good job with integration, and we celebrate integration. You would never question whether or not someone who was Asian with an accent was American. That just wouldn't. It's just it's not part of how we think. But that being said, we have there's still work to be done, and there's still real challenges. And as you see, as you see over and over again, played out in the headlines of the news, that this is still a real problem. And it goes into the whole journey, on the American journey on race. Now, the American journey on race is one of those things that you would need 3 hours and lectures and all sorts of different people to talk about the American journey on race. It's inherently difficult. A lot of people out there saying, well, you elected a black president, sort of American racial problems are over. It's just not true. This is, historically, one of an incredibly troubled relationship that is that's of course rooted in the original in slavery, and then has bubbled up through the civil rights movement and whatnot. Now, everything I said has been negative, and I think that actually there have been real positive strides made on this topic. Baltimore is a little challenging. Ferguson, Missouri is certainly a little challenging because the concept of riots is, of course, is kind of harder to justify. But we used to condone. This is the thing. So in the 50s, in certain parts of the country, you would almost condone the sort of behavior that was happening. It was what we would call institutionalized, meaning that there was kind of institutionalized racism embedded in society. And I would argue that even though there is still institutionalized racism in parts inside the American system, and you're seeing that play out occasionally in the police force and on on TV and whatnot, that the society doesn't tolerate it anymore. And that's why you see tens of thousands of people marching over the Brooklyn Bridge when the Eric Garner chokehold incident. I am, as an American, very troubled by this, and I will tell you that. And this is why I'm not, I'm less, to be honest with you, I'm not as appalled by the video shooting of the thing of the incident in South Carolina. What I'm appalled by is the fact that it probably happens every day when it's not actually caught on camera. And there's probably going to be justice for that guy. Maybe, hopefully. There's an indictment at least. But is there justice for everybody else? I think you look at this incident and you compare it to something that happened 50 years ago, because we just had the March on Selma, and the president spoke at it, a beautiful, amazing speech, which really, really details the American journey on race really beautifully, which I could never do justice to. But part of that incident, one of the reasons why it was most important, was because it was one of the first times that people outside of this small community, where real racism was condoned, saw it on TV. So we saw, I wasn't alive, but you saw with fire hoses and used on protesters and dogs attacking people and people being beaten. And it was a seminal moment in the American Civil Rights Movement, because you saw the population who had heard about racism in the South for a long time actually start to do something about it and change the system. And that's what happened. And I'm hoping that these incidents will lead to that. We've heard about this conflict between the African American community and police for years and years and years. But when you see it, it's different. And I think we see it now, and it affects us dramatically. And I just, you just hope. I mean, we're not perfect. Well, we're certainly not perfect. But this is an opportunity for us to be self-reflective and actually make real changes. So, I mean, you've seen lots of communities in the U.S., it's dozens and dozens reach out to the U.S. Justice Department and say, we have a huge problem here. How do we fix it? And it's not easy, considering what I said earlier about the racial dynamic in the U.S., but we have a lot of work to do. But I will say this, and I'll finish where I started, that you can't take the progress away from us. We have made real progress here. And I would argue as loud as I possibly can that that American society is more inclusive, more open to diversity, but certainly than it ever has been in history, and that's a good thing. But we still got work to do. Thank you.
I'm thinking when Obama chooses ambassadors for countries all around the world, he's matching the person with the country. Why do you think that you got matched with Denmark, personality-wise and professional?
Oh gosh, it's such a, I don't know, I'm really happy that I'm here. It's, it's really wonderful. I don't know, in truth, I don't think anyone at the White House knew that and look, I don't know if you think I'm a good match for Denmark. I feel like I'm a good match, or I feel like, I should say this, I feel like Denmark is a good match for me. And it's, I've absolutely loved my 20 months here, and I've loved the engagement, I've loved the work, I've loved the people, I love the culture of the country. But it is, I do think, you do have to look at each individual country, you have to look at the person. So it's, the difference in some ways is he knew me very well, because I worked with him very closely for 8 years, and we used to travel together and all the rest. And I'm not sure whether or not it was specific Denmark or Northern Europe or it's all of the rest, but it sure feels good. I will tell you that. I like to think that people were sitting late at night piecing this puzzle together and thinking about different skill sets and personality traits and all the rest. But I don't know that that's really the case. But I do feel like it's that Denmark is a good fit for me. So I am very appreciative that he chose this country for me and not somewhere else.
Thank you. My name is Christian P. Lorentzen. I'm a member of the Danish Parliament for the Liberal Party, elected here in Viborg.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions, Mr. Ambassador.
Yeah.
The first one is related to the great news about the huge Apple investment here in the neighborhood of Viborg.
Yeah.
And my question is, do you think it's possible to attract more investment like that from the United States, maybe even in this area, so that we have some kind of Silicon Valley number 2 here around Viborg? Is it possible for us to attract more investment, and what do we have to do it? And the second question is related to the security policy. We see quite a concerning development in Russia, and we see the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and it concerns quite many Danes and also Eastern Europeans. So my question is, will the American commitment to the security policy in Europe stay on the current high level, also in the frame of NATO? Or is the development in the United States going towards that Europe has to cope with themselves, and we will not use as many resources as we have done so far? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take the second one first, and then because that's the first one's a happy question, which I look forward to. The second one, so it's a great question and one I get all the time, because so there was, and I think this stems from, I'll go back to the Russia piece, but it goes back to the American commitment to Europe generally, and I think which is the overall broad theme of your question. So this stems from the whole, I believe that the general theme of the question stems from something that, it was essentially statements and announcements made from the U.S. early in the Obama administration about the pivot to Asia, about sort of taking resources away from traditional allies, diplomatic posts, and moving them towards Asia. So I'll answer that part first, and then we'll talk more specifically about Europe and how I believe the Obama administration views Europe. The answer to about the pivot to Asia is that, first of all, if we were not looking at Asia in a different way than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we wouldn't be doing our jobs. Asia is the most dynamic, rapidly changing, growing economies in the world. Militaries are changing and growing, all the rest. So yes is the truth, is that we are looking at Asia in a different way than we were before. But I would say so is Europe. And if they're not, they should be, you know. But I think to this point, I always say it's, you know, since I've been here in 20 months, the Danish Queen and the Danish Prime Minister have not been to the U.S., but they have been to China, Japan, South Korea. You know, it says something. It says something about where people are looking in a way that they haven't been before. But I do not think that Denmark values the U.S. any less than they did before. It's just that they're acknowledging what's changing and growing at a more rapid pace. As far as NATO is concerned, though, I think there were a lot of people before Crimea before the Russian invasion of Crimea, who were sort of questioning the relevance of NATO. Americans were never one of them, I will say. But probably parts of America were, so parts of the U.S. were. I don't think you hear any voice inside the United States in this day and age that questions the relevance of NATO. We will be very firm with our NATO allies. I mean, just to give a little bit of context, we spend over, I believe it's about 4% of our GDP on defense spending. That is obviously the largest GDP in the world, and 77, I believe, % of all NATO spending. So we will be very straight up with our NATO allies, and you know, just to give you perspective, Denmark's at 1.3% of GDP in defense spending. We will be, and the NATO pledge is 2%. And let's also be real clear, Denmark's in very good company on this. Virtually every ally in Europe is below 2%, which is the NATO pledge. We know that we have to do more than everybody else, but we think 77% is probably too much. When we have the stakes still at our doorstep, when we still have the threat at our doorstep that we have, and you look at things like Russia, and you look at the Middle East. So our argument is we will never turn our back on the one alliance that has been there for us from the very first day our country is founded. And it will be just as, if not more important historically than it ever has been. But you know, we do think that we will continue to address that issue with our European partners, without a doubt. Did that mostly answer your second question? Okay. The first question about Apple, you know, it's such a wonderful story, and I will say this, and I say this to Danish audiences all the time. The Danish brand is so much better than I think you all know it is. So it's the Danish brand in the United States, and I've said this a few times today, is I don't think Americans necessarily know what it. You know, Americans won't necessarily know where Denmark is specifically. They may not have been here before. But generally speaking, Denmark. When you think of Scandinavia as an American, thing is, you know, clean, green, well-made. You think of Vikings and fairy tales and pastries and all sorts of Legos. Also, actually, not enough Americans know that Lego is Danish, which is frustrating to me. But the point is that these are all inherently positive concepts. And and I could talk about this forever because I feel very passionately about it, as you can probably tell. But sustainability is something that if you were to ask, you know, a random American, you know, if they knew a few things about sort of modern day Scandinavia, they would know that about your commitment to green energy. And that's a great thing, and that's inherently a positive brand in the United States. One of the reasons, of course, is I said this in a speech just last night, saying that, you know, that your commitment to sustainability is debated around, is talked about in dinner tables around the world, I would argue, as well as in boardrooms of arguably the most important company in the world. And that matters. It's a good thing. And so I actually think you can double down on that brand. I would say this to political leaders. I'd say this to business leaders. I would say this to individuals that, you know, celebrate that, sell it. To tell people when they're traveling or where you're traveling, talk about where you come from. Because I think that there's opportunity not just for American business to continue to invest in places like Denmark. I can't speak necessarily to this region versus other parts. I mean, you'll need to build the incentives for those companies, which I know you so brilliantly did just down the road from here. But that's the work of the local government, and you know, I think that's just great. But I think that there, I mean, I was with a pharmaceutical group from Chicago just yesterday morning, and one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, based in Chicago, was contemplating opening, you know, an R&D facility here based on your high skilled, you know, but based on the labor market. I mean, the point is that there's all these opportunities, and I want to seize on all of them. My job is not just to bring American companies here, but also help Danish companies grow in the U.S. So just last month, I brought a delegation of 20 Danish companies to the U.S. Who want to break into that market, and I mean, it was everything from, you know, some of the largest Danish companies who want more help, you know, growing there, to, you know, a company called Flødebolle Inc. that wants to sell Flødebolle in the U.S. And that's awesome. And I love Flødebolle, so I'm excited about the idea. And for someone, and I have personal experience of this, who's ever tried to bring Flødebolle on a plane, they do not survive particularly well with air pressure. So I brought them home for Christmas to give them to my family, and my suitcase was a marshmallow mess when I unpacked. So we need to figure out how to manufacture Flødebolle in the United States in order to sell it there, and change the name, because we can never say that. Yeah, but those are the kinds of things that we can do. So my overall point in answering the question is that yes, there's fantastic opportunity, not just for, I don't know about little mini Silicon Valley, I love the idea, but there's fantastic opportunities to engage both ways.
We have a question from here.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I want to take it away from Flødebolle for a quick second.
Yeah, okay,
I would like to apologize in advance for going back to foreign policy. How has the U.S.'s strategy in the Middle East changed? Because it looks like that you're pulling out of the whole counterinsurgency, like operation thing, you know, the nation-building aspect, and just focusing on strategic bombing. Have you given up on the nation-building, or do you think that'll come at some point in the future?
You know, I'll answer the question. Generally speaking, I think that, you know, with a presidential election, one of the things that's kind of great about being president of the United States is you have complete and total authority to set foreign policy of the country. So of course, every single time you have a shift in presidency, there will be a significant shift in the direction of American foreign policy. I shouldn't say that. That's not necessarily true. But there will be a shift of some sort in American foreign policy. And that might not be the parts of the world you're focusing on, but that could just be a shift in sort of the way you deal with that part of the world. And I think, look, what you've seen from the Obama administration is, well, it's really no surprise, because he ran on this in 2007, is a recommitment to diplomacy. So, you know, you see that with Cuba, you see that with Iran, and these are not necessarily success stories yet. I would argue that Cuba is, but it's still a work in progress. Iran is definitely still very much a work in progress, but there's, you know, this tenuous agreement that I think is encouraging. And then you look at sort of our fight against ISIL generally. You're right. I mean, the idea. So you asked a question about nation building. Now, nation building implies that you likely have, you know, a substantial American force, substantial American presence on the ground in any given country at any given time. There's no political appetite for that in the United States at this moment. So I'm not going to say necessarily you take that option off the table in any instance, but I could pretty safely say you're not going to see it in the short term, because Americans, and I would argue probably, you know, Danes, Brits, French, or whomever would tolerate it. There's no political appetite for that either. for a major American deployment in certain parts of the world. That being said, I will say that the fight against ISIL has changed some things, at least in the psyche of Americans, in the sense that, we have a responsibility to ensure that that madness does not continue and does not bleed into other parts of the world. And came up with this strategy, which the Danes are playing an integral part in the bombing and the training of regional forces. I will say this: I think maybe it's not an entire shift in strategy, but it's a bit of a shift. Is the sense that the neighboring countries have got to play a role in the security, and more substantial role in the security of the Middle East. So you cannot just. You have to leave a country and a situation where their local forces can combat the troubles on the ground. And I think that's what and Danes are doing that alongside Americans right now as well, to ensuring that the Iraqi security forces can actually effectively combat the threats. But also, look, the Saudis need to play a role. The other countries in the region need to play a role. But you're seeing that happen. I mean, the fight against ISIL is one of the most broad political, military coalitions that we've had in a very, very long time. And that's a very, very positive thing, I think. So yeah, it's a bit of a shift in American foreign policy, but that comes with presidential campaigns and presidential leadership. But thank you.
A question about climate change. What do you think about the situation? We know, of course, that Obama government is quite positive around this question, but the Republicans, I think, has another opinion. But what do you think about the Republicans, let's say the people in the United States that vote for them? Do you think they have the same opinion, or is it a wrong picture we get there?
So I think, there are plenty of Republicans, and I would argue the vast majority of Republicans who and this may not have been true 10 years ago, but that accept climate change as a principle, accept the concept of global warming as a principle. It's still stupidly debated that whether or not people have an impact on whether or not the climate is changing. I believe that is scientifically proven. There is I would argue at this point, a fairly small minority, but they're politically influential. I would argue that too. That might argue with that point. But I'll say this on climate change, and I will speak about the Obama administration position on this. Is that actually, if anyone wants something great to watch, they should watch the president's kind of comedic routine at the National Press Dinner on last Saturday night, where he makes his feelings on climate change very, very clear in a very funny way. But he wants this to be a big part of his legacy. He wants the concept of climate change, and more specifically, the American acknowledgement that we have historically been a major part of the problem, and we are still a part of the problem. But at least going forward, let's also be a part of the solution. So that's what these things that you're seeing come out of the Obama administration are all about. These EPA regulations that are being challenged into court, the agreement with China, which I think is one of the most significant, even though I would say environmentalists argue that that's not good enough, and I'm sure that very well may be, that could be true from a lot of people's opinion, but the fact that he brought China to the table when they've never been to the table before is, in my mind, the most significant part of this. We're optimistic about Paris. We're optimistic about the COP21 in Paris in December. We think that there can be a deal made here on the international level, addressing these issues in a substantive way. It's not going to be easy, but it might be the first time that we're really able to do that. On the political side in the U.S., look, one of the things that I will say this, and I will say that most people look at the United States in a too simplified way, meaning you just look at what we're doing on the federal government side. I would be the first among you who would be incredibly frustrated that we don't do enough on the federal level on some of these issues. But when you look at what individual cities are doing, once you look at what individual states are doing in reducing, actually, we were just at a presentation earlier today when, mentioning that the state of Hawaii wants to be, 100% renewable by 2040, I think. It's not passed yet, but this is what they're talking about. Individual cities are right in line with that. I was at an event yesterday with a guy who runs sustainability for Novozymes, and he was talking to me about how Walmart is now one of the countries around the world that's leading the sustainability effort in the private sector. That actually shocked me as an American, because Walmart for so many years has had this terrible brand when it comes to issues like this. So it was great to hear. I say this ultimately because I think that Americans for the first time, and Americans at all levels, are starting to realize that this is a major issue that we have got to get on board and be part of the solution and get past and try to internationally create some sort of deal. But also, we have a responsibility. Every company, every city, every state, every citizen has a responsibility to do their part. And again, look, I'm not saying that this is still easy. It's not easy. And we're not there yet by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think you're seeing an evolution in the American perspective on this topic. And that's a good thing. That's a very, very good thing. Thank you. Hi.
Hi. Mr. Ambassador, could you please elaborate a little bit more on the cooperation about the Arctic matters, whether it's mainly about the environmental issues or more political issues? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the thing about the Arctic, which is so the Arctic is usually discussed you usually talk about climate change when you talk about the Arctic, and that's all true, because the melting ice is what's driving the geopolitical importance of the Arctic. But the reason why it's becoming more and more geopolitically important is because countries around the world are viewing that part of the world as an opportunity that they've never had before, because there used to be ice everywhere, and now there's opportunities for shipping routes, and there's opportunities for fishing and tourism, and of course you throw the Russia piece into it, and it's all the more complicated. So my point in saying that is that you now have a scenario in the Arctic which has been one of the most pristine and peaceful regions of the world, at a sort of like, it's not, a slightly more unsettled place. The fear that the Arctic in some ways in 20 years could look entirely different than it does today. And that needs our support now. So the issues, we're actually chairing the Arctic Council right now as of last week, and our priorities are really, the military piece is completely out of the Arctic Council, but the point really is to, our three main priorities are to address climate change, protect the oceans, and to make the Arctic a sustainable place for the people who live up there to live. So there's all that, but then there's investment. There's dealing with these continued issues about shipping routes, shipping lanes, what you do, what happens. I mean, we saw another ferry disaster in the Mediterranean 2 weeks ago, I guess now, an absolute catastrophe. If that happened in the Arctic, I know a lot of people died in the Mediterranean, but if that happened off the coast of Greenland, everybody would die, because there's nothing, you could not do anything. There are no boats up there to put anybody on. So as the Arctic becomes more commercialized, and or even just more people have access to it, whether it's tourists or anyone, there are more issues that enter into that equation. That's all because of climate change. But the sort of chain reaction from climate change makes it an incredibly important and complicated part of the world that we have to keep a very close eye on. I would argue that Americans, we're not very close to the Arctic because we're only an Arctic country because of this little sliver of Alaska. It's not all that different than Denmark in some ways because, you're obviously not Arctic down here, but you're Arctic because of Greenland, an important piece of your country that exists pretty far away. But but because of climate change and because of the important countries that are frankly a part of the Arctic Alliance, we're looking at the Arctic in a way that we haven't looked at it, certainly since the end of the Cold War. You might argue ever that we feel like we have a larger responsibility to make sure that the Arctic cooperation continues to be peaceful and productive.
Yes, one more question.
Okay, last question. I don't need that one. What are your thoughts on the possibilities of the new transatlantic trade agreement?
Yeah.
Big question, but the timeline, is it far along the road or?
Absolutely. No,
yeah.
It's one of my favorite things to talk about. So we're negotiating right now a trade agreement between the U.S. and the EU. For a whole bunch of reasons, I think this is a fantastic idea for both Denmark and the United States. I won't bore you right now with all my reasons why. I'm happy to talk about it to anyone who wants to listen to me afterwards. But so the timeline is still quite. For me, it's not a matter of when you get it done; it's if, and we need to get it done. So I am not. I think Angela Merkel a month or so ago said she wants it done in 2015. I don't know that that's possible. I would like it done by the end of the Obama administration, personally. But again, that's not as important as actually getting it done. 6 months, one way or the other, won't really matter as long as actually that we actually succeed. The challenges here are real, and this is the largest trade agreement in the history of the world, bringing together closer the two largest economies in the world, meaning the United States and Europe. So much, I think, in the question I talked about over here, I believe that the world is better served when the transatlantic relationship is as close as can possibly be. And I don't mean that just in the military side, I also mean that on the economic side. I believe that we have I believe that if we set the standards for the world, and I think we're about a third of all global trade. And if we set the standards, and you can debate it on the margins, but we have the highest standards for labor and environment, and I don't think anyone really debates that if we set those standards and set them in place, that the rest of the world will have to rise to our level. So for us, this is about actually setting the global standard, and it's incredibly important, not just for the economy, and I do think, of course, it's a job creator, and it will grow every economy, but and certainly Denmark. I mean, I can just speak about Denmark and the U.S. I think it's inherently good. I mean, you're a free trade country. You know this. You're built on this. If you form a company here, you think immediately about going beyond the borders of Denmark, and that's what this is about. But it is going to be complicated, and it should be debated. I mean, look, this is, again, the biggest free trade agreement in the history of the world. You don't want to go into that lightly. Everyone should have an opinion on this and should be talking about it around dinner tables and talking about the stakes. We go to a lot of forums where there are people who disagree with me vehemently on this, but I have no problem with that. I love that. I love that conversation. I just wish more people would actually care about it because it is that important. But thank you for the question.
Og det var det sidste spørgsmål. It was the last question. So the three Rotary clubs in Viborg are most honored that you accepted our invitation to speak here today. And I must say, we had high expectations. These expectations have been fully met with both the speech and your good answers to the questions. And I think they had good questions.
They did.
Yes. We will thank you for coming here today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Let me just say, I just want to thank you guys. Thank you all so much. It really, and I said it at the outset, that it means so much to me that you all come out and listen and ask such fantastic questions and engage in this debate. I really hope to come back to people. I hope to do it more than once, and I hope you'll continue to listen and engage in these issues. So thank you so much.
Hvis der er nogen, der har fået en presse i, kan vide, hvad de der Rotary-folk, de er for nogen, så vil der stå nogen hernede og kunne fortælle lidt om det, og I kan spørge, ellers så har I jo papirerne her. Og er der nogen, der er interesseret i, hvad er det nu for noget, det erhvervsakademi Daniel her, så er der også nogen, der kan fortælle lidt om det. Og ellers vil jeg gerne sige tak for fremmødet, og tak for i dag.